Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again James Turk and John Rubino. Both of these gentlemen have been on this show before. I'm talking to James Turk from his home in New Hampshire, and John Rubino from his office in Idaho. Both of these gentlemen, as I say, have been with me several times in the past, so I'm not going to read their bios, but I would be remiss if I didn't let you know how you can get in touch with their work and follow what they're doing on an ongoing basis, because both of them have an awful lot of good things and a lot of great insights in the markets and what's going on that is very important. I think that you do check them out if you're not already familiar and following their work. James Turk contributes his wisdom to goldmoney.com, and there you can just go to goldmoney.com. You can also access that through their banner on my website, J. Taylor Media, as well as the Voice America Business Channel site. And I should mention also that Alistair McLeod, who's frequently on this show, is a frequent contributor to Gold Money as well. And then John Rubino, who's been on very often on this show, not often enough probably, but dollarcollapse.com is where you can go to catch John's wisdom and his insights, publishes prolifically there. And so both of those guys, I'm really pleased to have them with me. Welcome, James, and welcome, John, to Turning Hard Times into Good Times.
Thank you, Jay.
Hi, Jay. Yeah,
really good to talk to both of you, and it's a marvel of modern technology that we can do so, and your voices come through so clearly across the continent. I want to talk, of course, about the money bubble, and John, you and I talked about it. We just scratched the surface, and that's about all we'll do today. But if we can get people to understand that there is an awful lot of really good stuff in this book, I should mention to start with that there are an awful lot of charts and illustrations that there's no way we can do justice to all of that information here on the radio, but we can hopefully give you a sense of the need to buy this book and to pick it up and read it. Part one, we talk about all the time on this show, and that is how we've gotten ourselves into this mess. So I would rather not spend too much time issuing that, but that was part one in your book, how we got where we are. It's obvious to those of us who see the world through the lens of Austrian economics that the policies orchestrated in the 1930s didn't work very well, if at all, and I would say they didn't work at all, and they're not working any better now. But repeatedly, the policymakers continue to do the same thing over and over again. The definition somebody has given for insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expecting different results. I'd like to start with you, James. Why do you think policymakers can't see what Austrian thinkers see, and why are they continuing to do the same thing over and over again when it's proven to be folly?
Well, I think they can see, Jay. I think they just have a different agenda. They're not really acting in the best interests of the general population. They're acting in the best interests of the people who they serve, and that's basically, the financial establishment, or what President Eisenhower called in his farewell address to the nation, the military-industrial complex. I think we're seeing it firsthand. And just to give you an example, during the 2008 bailout, the poll showed that something like 75 to 80% of the population was against it, but they did it and bailed out the banks anyway. It's the people have lost touch, lost control of government, in my view.
Mm-hmm. John, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, from an elected official standpoint, inflation and easy money and the kind of policies that are being pursued now are relatively pain-free. They push the pain off into the future, whereas trying to live within your means is extremely painful in the short run. Mm-hmm. And it makes it harder for these guys to get reelected. So people who live within an election cycle, or corporate leaders who live within next quarter's earnings time frame, they're always going to choose the easy way out. And that's what everybody in the world is doing right now. We're all choosing to, or our leaders are all choosing to try to push the pain off into the future, at which point they hope their successors will have to deal with it, and they'll be long gone. And so we're seeing human nature in action here on a vast scale. And the basic premise is that if you borrow too much money, all the options become painful, and it's only a choice then of what kind of time frame you want to accept the pain in. And we're all going for pain in the future versus pain in the present.
Well, that's certainly, I think, a kinder explanation than the one James gave. Are you a little less cynical about the motives behind the policies?
They're not mutually exclusive, though, because probably James's is the main explanation. But the fact that it's human nature to try to avoid pain is something that's also operating right now.
Yeah. You know, we talk to Daniel McAdams on this show very frequently. In fact, he'll be on later today in the second hour. And one of the things that really has hit me is that our foreign policy is just like that in a way. We keep doing the same things that create greater difficulty, mess up nations more and more, just as we do on the economic sphere. But anyway, that's an observation. I shouldn't waste time because we have so much stuff to cover. Consequences and Scenarios, the second part of the book, part 2. And there were so many great chapters here, but one I want to ask you about, James, because it's something that I have felt very strongly about. As a matter of fact, the reason I got interested in gold to start with was because I had a history professor back in 1967 who was absolutely convinced there was a correlation between the debasement of money and work ethic and even morality. And chapter 6 of your book, Unsound Money Equals a Corrupt Society. James, and both of you, but start with you, James. Can you give us an understanding of the relationship? How does unsound money lead to a corrupt society?
Yeah, because money is central to society. We use it as a tool to improve our situation as we work to generate money to fulfill our needs and fulfill our wants. But if the money doesn't do what it's supposed to do, if it doesn't preserve purchasing power, if it favors certain interests as opposed to others' interests, if it's not a neutral tool in commerce and is a political weapon, that in fact it affects your relationship in terms of how you view institutions generally, and more specifically, how you view the government or the institutions that are issuing that money. And if the money is corrupt, inevitably society becomes corrupt as well. I mean, Lenin supposedly said that the best way to debauch a society or to destroy a society is to debauch the currency. And I think it's true.
John, something to add to that?
Well, yeah. A country's money is basically a promise on the part of the country to the people holding that money that if you trust them, if you keep dollars or euros or yen as your savings, that in the future you'll be able to use those currencies to buy the same amount of stuff in terms of value. And so we're all the major countries are breaking that promise by systematically decreasing the value of their currencies. And you see that reverberating through society now. There's a lot of press lately about how companies are starting to debase their products without telling us. Boxes are the same size, but there are fewer cornflakes in there. Or lately, I think it was Burger King was revealed to be using wood pulp, basically cellulose, in its burgers. And that comes directly from a depreciating currency because it raises the costs to businesses, but they can't always pass those costs along. So their solution is to give us a worse deal, decrease the value of their products. And so that leads us not only to mistrust the government, but to mistrust the big companies, the brand names we used to trust.
Sure.
And so that causes cynicism to become the dominant mindset of a society. And once you reach that point, when nobody trusts anybody else, you're halfway gone. And that's where we are in most of the big countries around the world now.
Right. So it starts with a deceitful currency and ends up in deceitful products and tricks and games that are played all the time. It certainly does make sense. Certainly another chapter 7, perpetual wars and the emerging police state. You're tying also to debasing of currency, I guess, or the printing of money. That certainly makes an awful lot of sense to me. I made an argument, discussed this issue with an author on this show, whose name escapes my memory now. He worked in he lives in Thailand. In any event, and he said, and I made the point that if the United States hadn't gone off the gold standard in 1971, it would have been impossible for the United States and the Anglo-American Empire to expand as it has, and now to the point where it's knocking on the door of China and Russia, and expand its empire militarily because it's been able to finance it. And his response, Richard Duncan, that's who it was, his response was that yes, but we wouldn't have been able to defeat the Soviet Union if we hadn't done that. and so that we are better off for having a printing press and a fiat money as a result of it. That was his argument. I know that neither of you guys would agree with that. I would be shocked if you do. But James, would you like to respond to that notion and perhaps talk a little bit about the topic of Chapter 7, perpetual wars in the emerging police state?
Yeah, I disagree with the notion that the Soviet Union fell apart because of us being able to print paper money. The Soviet Union fell basically apart because it had made promises that were not sustainable, and the other factor, of course, being modern communications. You know, when you have a wall dividing two people, and people on one side of the wall can see how people on the other side of the wall are actually living, that creates a lot of resentment from the people who are doing poorly compared to the people who are doing well. And as a consequence of modern communication and information flow through technology, it was unsustainable that people behind the Iron Curtain would continue to live under those circumstances when they saw what was happening in the rest of the world. It really had nothing to do with America's ability to print money out of thin air.
Yeah, I guess the argument was that it enabled Ronald Reagan to outspend the Soviet Union. You hear this argument all the time, that it enabled the United States to outspend the Soviet Union, but then on the other side of it is that, as you say, James, the Russian, the USSR was falling apart anyway because it was a socialist society that really abandoned and got rid of capitalism, essentially, and we know that wealth is built on capitalism. It's not built with socialism and consumption. But again, that's one of those policies. Consumption. Keynes would have us believe that we get rich by consuming, which is doesn't make any sense. But anyway,
it doesn't make any sense. And one of my favorite quotes is from Margaret Thatcher. She said the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money, and that's where we are.
That's what we're doing. Absolutely, John. Any thoughts on Chapter 7?
Yeah, James, you're absolutely right. The Soviet Union would have collapsed under its own weight eventually. But having said that, an unlimited credit card, which is basically what a global reserve currency that's also a fiat currency is for the United States, can be used for good things. I mean, just like if any of us was handed an unlimited credit card, we might do some good stuff with all that money that we could borrow. And some of what the U.S. has done has been good around the world. But I think the vast bulk of our foreign policy has been one huge mistake after another that we finance with borrowed money and pursued because we felt omnipotent. We could buy the biggest military empire that has ever existed, and nobody could touch us militarily. So we've been blundering around the world thinking we could do anything we wanted to, and we've ended up making enemies almost everywhere. You know, lately we're spying on everybody in sight, and even our old friends are mad at us. And in the Middle East, we have been supporting one group and then another group and then another group until everybody is our enemy. And you can trace that back to the fact that we had all this money to throw around, and it corrupted the decision-making process because we could basically do anything. We didn't have to prioritize, and that's what easy money does to a society. And this is just the foreign affairs version of that storyline.
Yeah, that's a good point, John, because the other side of easy money, of course, is the debt that comes with it. And when you're borrowing money, you can use it in two ways. You can use it effectively or you can waste it. You know, if you're borrowing money to build a house, you're doing something constructive with it. If you're borrowing money to go on vacation, you're not doing something constructive with it. And what's been happening to the U.S. government has been borrowing trillions and trillions of dollars, and it's not being used for useful purposes. It's being largely wasted.
Yeah, look at the Iraq War. We spent whatever it is now, $2 or $3 trillion, and we accomplished exactly nothing. You know, the country is spinning out of control once again, and it's threatening to pull the rest of the Middle East into a pan-Islamic war. And so it's like the last 10 years never happened, or actually it's worse than it would have been if the last 10 years had never happened. So that money is completely wasted and then some.
Yeah, indeed. It's sort of, I have to keep thinking of what Ron Paul said when he was running for president, one of the debates. He said, the reason they're over here is because we're over there. So we're spending all this money bombing, killing people, and of course we're told over here that it's all necessary. But in the meantime, it's like taking a stick in a hornet's nest beating up the hornet's nest and expecting nothing to happen. And it just seems to me that so this whole thing, because we're now paranoid about them coming over here and hitting us, is that the connection? And in part, that might be one connection, at least, to the rising police state, because we have an emerging police state, no doubt about it. I mean, we know now, thanks to Snowden, that everything we say, everything this discussion included, can be available to the police state. Either of you want to comment on that, and then we do have to take a break and before we come back. But any more comments?
Yeah, I think the police state, Jay, really is again a function of being able to create money out of thin air. Mm-hmm. If the government is given that power, and this is an unconstitutional power that the U.S. government has taken on itself, because the Constitution doesn't allow it. But if you give the government that power, it's going to use that power to gain more power, and ultimately you're going to go to a police state circumstances.
Right.
And the other part of the police state, if we have time, Jay,
go ahead, sure.
Okay, is that we've borrowed so much money that we've created the potential for extreme financial instability at home. And so governments are building up the potential police state as a way of dealing with the possibility that we're going to see civil unrest because of a financial collapse. So they've got two serious motivations right now to become Big Brother. You know, there are foreign enemies that they see as very real, and there's domestic unrest very probably coming because of a financial collapse that they've engineered. So either way, you get a rationale from their point of view for becoming a lot more authoritarian.
Yeah. So we've got a big mess on our hands. We know that, and so we do have to go to a break now. And when we come back, I want to get your ideas about how we should deal with the problems that we're facing, what we might be looking at in the future, unfortunately, and then what's the best way to protect our families and ourselves and take care of our loved ones in light of what is likely to take place. It's hard to know the shape, the time, exactly how it's going to unfold, but it's pretty predictable that things are not going to be good when the system breaks down, when the financial system breaks down. So we're going to go to breakdown. When we come back, more with James Turk and John Rubino. Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have James Turk and John Rubino with me to talk a bit more about their book, The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. And we left off with the not anything terribly new in terms of what we talk about on this show. We're in a mess. We've got debt much greater than can be serviced without debasing the currency en masse. We know all of this is in play. But I guess what we want to find out now, maybe to get an idea of what sort of things we might be looking at in the future. Let me ask you this, if you just listen to the mainstream media and not anything on the internet, I've got CNBC on here, I keep track of the prices, the equity markets, the gold prices and all that. Or if I turn it on and I listen to what they're saying, you'd get the sense that things are pretty good again. The other day, somebody was saying, "Oh, the U.S. banks have nothing to worry about. They're sound again." And there's, the Portuguese banks, yeah, they're shaky, but we don't have to worry over here because our banks, there's no question about their ability to pay. What are your thoughts on the soundness of the U.S. banking system, James? Start with you, perhaps.
The banks are still very highly leveraged. They have a lot of debt relative to the size of their capital base. And if you look at monetary history, Jay, there's always a bank crisis every few years.
Yeah.
The last big one was 2008, so we're probably due for another one in the not-too-distant future. And with the economy being as weak as it is, the first quarter actually declined, and the odds are that the second quarter probably declined as well. That means that a lot of the loans that banks have made are going to be not repayable, and that's going to create more problems for the banks. So, banking by its nature is never sound, simply because they have so much debt relative to their capital base, and as a result, we have these recurring crises.
And,
John?
The global financial system had a near-death experience in 2008, 2009, and you would think that kind of an experience would lead the financial system to want to simplify. In other words, lower the amount of derivatives out there so it won't blow up the system again, and decrease the leverage that the big banks operate with. And instead, we went the opposite direction after the crisis. The big banks used an implicit government guarantee to get even bigger. They've taken massive market share in mortgages and other kinds of lending away from the rest of the banking system. So the big banks now are more highly leveraged than they were. They have bigger derivatives books and bigger asset bases. So they're actually more fragile now than they were. We're more in danger of a huge financial crisis that would dwarf 2008, 2009 now than we've ever been. And so it's yet another example of us making exactly the wrong policy decisions, and which can also be traced back to so much debt that we've taken on. The right policy decision is painful. Therefore, we go the opposite direction, and we do it again and again.
We do indeed. And but however, when I wake up this morning and take my shower and I turn on Bloomberg here in New York, I'm told that Goldman Sachs beat their top line and they made more money than the analysts ever dreamed they would make this quarter. J.P. Morgan likewise had a blockbuster quarter. So this is what we hear on the mainstream media all the time. And indeed, of course, the banks were quote unquote capitalized with other people's money. They created money out of nothing and pumped it into the banks. Is this something that's going to go on and on? So if we're more highly leveraged, these guys can show big profits, take down big bonuses, and then but their balance sheets are not what they seem to be on surface, or who knows what they are, because we don't really know what's on the balance sheets of these big banks anymore. They don't really tell us. So can we look for a replay then? Is that what you're saying, John? Is it could be worse than 2008, 2009. We could be looking for something worse, and then what are they going to do? Are they going to bail-ins or bailouts, or what will they do to us this time?
Well, we've created the conditions for something that's more serious than 2008, 2009. And, how it plays out is anybody's guess. But when it happens, some kind of a crisis is guaranteed to happen. Maybe this time it'll be a currency crisis where we see the inflation spike and the value of one or two of the big currencies start to go down, and that reverberates through the financial system. Who knows? But when it happens, it'll hurt the big banks. It'll hurt all the banks, but especially the big, highly leveraged ones. And then we will go to some form of wealth confiscation or capital controls. And we're seeing the plans be put in place for that already. Europe is actively talking about just taking 5 or 10% out of everybody's bank account to save whatever bank gets in trouble next. And so we'll see a combination of capital controls that keep us from moving money outside the system, and bank bail-ins and other kinds of wealth taxes and other kinds of asset confiscations when the system next spins out of control and when the politicians get really desperate. So as individuals, that's our challenge. How do we structure our own finances so we're prepared for something like that? And that's not a simple question at all. Oh,
by no means is it simple. Yeah. James, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to respond to the point about the bank profits. With the profits being what they are, why aren't they paying, a fair rate of interest on savings accounts or certificates of deposit? Again, you can see that the way the financial system is structured, it's not structured to benefit the middle class. It's structured to benefit the banking system.
Indeed. I mean, my mother, my father's passed away, but my mother, who's 91 years of age, gets zero for her savings, and my mom and dad, both coming out of the Depression era, were both very careful about how they spent their money. They had nice savings for people of very modest means, and now they're essentially subsidizing the banks. That's the way I see it, by this artificial interest rate issue. And I want to talk to both of you, or get both of your opinions about interest in where the bond markets and where they may be heading. But I noticed Chapter 11, "They're Coming for Your Savings" is the title. Are you talking about the kind of bail-ins that Cyprus went through? Is that what you think might be possible, or what form might that take?
Well, they're coming in a number of different ways. I think a bail-in like Cyprus is one alternative, but low interest rates is they're taking away your savings
already.
As well.
Yeah, already.
Because,
yes.
The inflation rate is not what the government says. It's a lot more than 2%. It's probably closer to 9%, which is the way John Williams of Shadow Stats calculates it. And if you're only earning, 0.5% on a savings account, and the inflation rate is much more than that, you're losing purchasing power. Your wealth is being drained away.
Let me, while you mention that word inflation, let me ask you, what is inflation? You might define it for our listeners, because I think people have an erroneous concept of it. The Austrians see inflation simply as the increase in the money supply, I believe, but we're talking about inflation, as I understood it, years ago. It was the cost of living. You never hear that expression anymore. What is the cost of living? They don't talk about that. They just call it the inflation rate. But I always thought that in days gone by, when I was a lot younger, they used to say the cost of keeping a family of four alive. Well, you never hear that kind of language anymore, because if they really focused on the cost of keeping a family of four alive, as you say, James, it would be closer to 9%, not 2% or 1% or whatever. So maybe, James, just define, how do you define inflation? The government defines it one way. You know, they manipulate the numbers through hedonic pricing, through substitution, whatever, all kinds of gimmicks that they have. We know from our experience, my wife and I, that it isn't 2%, that it's costing 7 or 8% more this year than last year to live, at least. So how do you define it, James? What's your definition of inflation?
Yeah, the common definition is inflation is the rise in prices, but that's not really what inflation is. Inflation is the creation of too much money to cause the debasement and purchasing power of that money. And that's truly what inflation is. It's the loss of purchasing power of what you're using for currency.
Yeah. Well, and but it seems to me also one of the things we see inflation is a redistribution of wealth that occurs, and it's occurring in the stock market, in the asset prices that the rich and powerful are able to exploit. Is it not? I mean, we're continually having today we have a bit of a down day in the equity markets, but we've had a huge boom in the stock market since 2008, 2009. Is that part of it? I mean, so we have an increase in the money supply. They pump money into the system. It isn't getting out into loans that are being used in the economy, but it is being used as speculation, it seems, by the rich and powerful. Is that what's happening?
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. You know, when money's printed like this, it has to go somewhere. It's not going to be left in a bank, because people understand that they're not earning any interest income if they leave it in a bank. So it's going into assets that are perceived to be safe. You know, I live in London, England, and real estate prices are just going through the roof because it's perceived to be a safe haven. Same thing in Singapore. Stock markets around the world are going through the roof because it's better to own a company that owns tangible assets than to have money on deposit in a bank. We're seeing the collectibles market going sky high, antique cars, paintings, anything that cannot be produced by a printing press, that, you know, people see it as a store of value. All of these things are going up because there's just too much money being printed around the world.
Mm-hmm. And yet we're not seeing a commensurate rise in the price of gold as some of those other items that you mentioned, James. So why not? Well,
that's because governments are trying to keep the price of gold controlled, because as soon as the price of gold rises, then people see the red flag waving that there are problems with the monetary system. By keeping the price of gold controlled, it makes everything look better than it really is. It's the same reason that governments manipulate the inflation numbers and don't report the true rate of inflation.
Yeah, it certainly seems that Alan Greenspan understood that very well when he commented in Gold and Economic Freedom when he wrote that article in Ayn Rand's Subjectivist newsletter, that he understood very well. And so it seems to me someone who understood that and went about destroying the currency and having to hide and suppress the price of gold, which he apparently knew very well they were doing when he said, I think central banks stand ready to lease gold in increasing quantities should the price begin to rise, or something to that effect. So there's manipulation of the gold markets. I would say to people who are skeptical of that, why are you skeptical of manipulation of the gold markets? Tell me what market isn't manipulated, starting with, of course, the printing of money. But any thoughts to add, John, with regard to the manipulation of the gold markets?
Yeah, gold would be the only non-manipulated market if it was actually free. And you've got to think that at some point, the people who are buying the London penthouses and the fine art and everything would look around and see that gold and silver, which are traditionally in the class of assets that are bought by the super rich and that go up along with those other hard assets, that's the one category that has not soared yet. And that you'd see a lot of capital start flowing into precious metals and bring them up to parity. with these other asset classes. So we could see in the not-too-distant future, just from normal asset allocation processes going on among the people with the remaining capital in the world, could see a lot of money flowing into precious metals, and other things being equal, no big crisis necessarily. We could see them start to rise just to get them even again with these other asset classes.
In your book, you talk about the case for $10,000 gold and the case for $100 silver. James, would you care to comment on that? What is the case for $10,000 gold?
Yeah, those numbers might sound a little bit outrageous, but, for everybody who's listening who was alive back in 1971, it would have been outrageous to say that the gold price was going to go from $35 to $850, but it did do that. Or it would be it was also outrageous to say that the silver price was going to go to $50 10 years later from the $1.20 it was trading at the time. But silver did that as well. Basically, what we're saying is that gold and silver are both tremendously undervalued, and we're going to see a repeat of what happened in the 1970s as the understanding grows that the problems with the monetary system are too huge and that the dollar is way overvalued and precious metals are way undervalued.
Yeah, John, on that, and $100 silver was the other part. I guess, go ahead, John, if you have something to add.
The way you get a sense of how high gold and silver should go in terms of, for instance, dollars, is you look at how many dollars have been created. And then to bring the two into balance, in other words, to bring gold up to the point where you could have a gold-backed currency that is exchangeable with dollars. And dollars and gold, free exchangeability, you would have to get to around $10,000 an ounce for gold. Mm-hmm. And since that's the way the process normally works, a currency is debased until it has to be reset in terms of gold, and you make it a one-for-one exchangeable. Well, we need $10,000 gold, $10,000 an ounce gold to get there. And so we'll see that again sometime in the next few years if the normal process plays out as the way it has in history.
Do we need to see some sort of really serious inflation? And now we get back to that word inflation again. We already have inflation, if you use the Austrian definition, to justify, as you just said, John, to justify those kind of prices. But do we need to see something shake the confidence of the public, I think, to get to that point where they're willing to trade in their dollars for tangibles, for gold and other items like that? Do we need to see inflation to get those numbers, or could there be a reversal of this system? You both have talked about the enormous amount of indebtedness. Next week I'm going to have on this show David Stockman and Mish Shedlock together. Both of these gentlemen tend to be, last I talked to them anyway, both of them tend to be deflationist, and they understand that if the system were left alone as it is now, which of course it won't be and it is not being left alone, that an enormous amount of debt relative to income would throw us into the deepest depression we've ever experienced, probably. So there is that underlying fundamental that is deflationary because of the enormous amount of debt. Do either of you see the possibility of going in that direction at some point into a deflationary, similar to what we went in 2008, 2009 before they got control of it? James, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't really see the possibility of deflation. I mean, the Federal Reserve says that they'll do everything to prevent deflation, and in fact, that's what they are doing. They're printing money left and right, just like every other central bank in the world is doing. When it comes to money and its purchasing power, Jay, we have to remember that money has a supply and money has a demand. You sort of alluded to it when you talked about the confidence of people. People have to have confidence in the currency in order for them to hold it. If they don't have confidence in the currency when they receive it, they're going to spend it right away, and ultimately that creates two things. It will create inflation or higher prices, but it will also create a collapse in the currency. The velocity will increase, and people will exit the currency and hold things instead of currency. And I think we're seeing that to a certain extent now. at least at the super rich levels, with the London penthouses and the Singapore penthouses and works of art and things of that nature, the super rich are getting rid of their currency as fast as they possibly can in order to put it into real things. So I really don't see the possibility of a deflation. It's not going to be like the 1930s because we're not on a gold standard in the 1930s. We're on a dollar standard for all practical purposes. And what will happen, in my view, if you look at prices in terms of goods and prices of goods and services in terms of dollars, those prices will go up. But if you look at prices of goods and services in terms of gold or silver, those prices will go down. In other words, you'll have deflation, which is another way of saying that purchasing power of the money will go up if you buy things in terms of gold or silver, but you're going to have inflation if you look at it in terms of dollars.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the velocity issue that you talked about is one of the things that's remained relatively tame since the Federal Reserve pumped money into the system. John, do you see anything that could cause that to change anytime soon, that could shake confidence and cause people to trash the dollars in lieu of assets? We only got a couple of minutes left, but go ahead if you have some thoughts on that.
There are dozens of things that could happen out there right now that could send a global financial system into a crisis that would cause people to question the validity of the fiat currencies that they're using. But generally, an over-indebted system, its natural tendency is deflationary. The debt needs to be worked off, and it wants to fall into a 1930s-style depression. But we're in uncharted territory now because all of the major central banks of the world have unlimited printing presses, and they're actively leaning against the natural deflationary tendency in the economy. And because the amount of debt that's out there is huge but finite, and the printing presses are effectively unlimited, they'll probably win in the end. And we will probably overproduce currency, which will lead to some kind of a crisis of confidence in that currency, which will lead to the things we're talking about. All of a sudden there's this huge shift out of financial assets and into real assets at every level of society, not just among the super rich. And we get the Austrian crack-up boom, where nobody wants to hold dollars or euros or yen anymore, and that manifests as hyperinflation.
Yeah. Well, we have so much more ground to cover. We're out of time. My engineer tells me our time is basically gone. I want to thank both of you for being with us, but just to tell our listeners, the money bubble, what to do before it pops, so much more than we talked about today. What should you be doing with your money? I know both of you would start with owning physical gold and silver, no doubt. Stay out of debt. Those are issues I know you both believe very strongly in. Those are things we talk about all the time. But we do want to talk to you some more in the future, but more importantly, tell our listeners to go buy The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. You can get it, I guess, at all the major bookstores and probably on your website. I know, John Rubino, your website they can go to, right, which is dollarcollapse.com.
That's right, dollarcollapse.com.
And James Turk, you can buy at Gold Money as well to buy your book?
No, you can't buy it at goldmoney.com, but you can buy it online at amazon.com, of course.
Okay, very good. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you both for being with us.